I love the international perspective. How can international standards for digital identity use be established, and also kind of what are the roles that should be served by standard bodies, in your opinion?
So it's really a very, very interesting arena. If you kind of look around the globe, standards work has been driven by governments and places, governments that have been proactive. This market, including, there's been at least some cohesion that we begin to see between the Australian standards, the UK standards, the American, the Canadian standards. So that's actually good to see. But it's that core ID, and it's not fully recognized. EIDAS obviously helps a great deal with, I hope, UK continuing forward and the rest of Europe. But it is in this arena of additional data, things that we might say are beyond what's described in EIDAS, that the market's not dealt with yet. And through the course of my few-week round-the-world survey, I've seen that for sure in the German market, the Australian market, in the US market, the Canadian market. This has not been standardized, nor has it been here. There's certainly been some work, but if we're really going to get there, we're going to need likely a private sector oriented initiative in this realm. And that's really because of my point earlier. 90% of what we do is driven by private sector stuff that we do. Maybe 10% is driven by government. So if we're ignoring the great things that we want to achieve in private sector, if we're not injecting those needs and use cases in, we're not going to get the standards right. So I think it's a challenging area. It may be that it's worked first, almost de facto, through the commercial arena. The best is very likely that it gets worked within the financial services community, because it is global, right? It covers the world, and we found other standards that have been developed through that community that have then served the industry at large. The airline industry, of course, has done some standardization work around the globe, and that could be another in part related to those use cases. But I think commercial industry is going to have to step up and beginning working with government on what those standards can be.
Thank you very much. And Paul, I'd love your opinion. A great big piece on kind of necessity of standards. I know that you've got a very keen opinion on, so please do share.
Yeah, so firstly, you need to kind of go back and think about a more fundamental question. In fact, kind of what is an identity? So in the UK, we seem to kind of be of the opinion, and it's a name, it's a current address, it's a date of birth. But in actual fact, kind of when you start to get down to the details, you see that some people actually have two current addresses, so the identity becomes more complicated. You, of course, have previous addresses. You have other attributes which kind of really define you, such as your credit card number. Your credit card number starts to become part of your identity. Everything that you've done also then starts to become part of your identity. The transactions that you make with society, the payments that you make when you're banking, the social media accounts that you have, all start to become your identity. So really, as a way to start to put that all together, it's necessary to have some form of standard where you can start to use this information. So you can use the information in the way that you need to. So the identity data that you need to perform certain actions differs depending on what you're doing. If you're signing up for a bank account, then it's quite different to signing up for a social media account, as an example. So really, if you're going to go into the world where you make it easier for a consumer to sign up for services, you need to be able to define a level of trust around each element of data rather than the identity or just the name and address as a whole. So it's in fact necessary to look at standards on each and every element of an identity, not just an identity or a process as a whole. So from that point, I think to really get the trust in in identity attributes, it's necessary to standardize it. We couldn't look at it, for example, in the same way as we do in financial crime compliance as a risk-based approach, because it's not descriptive enough. To be able to use and trust an attribute, you need to know where it came from, how it was built, how it was put together. So a standard is what gives us that.
Any other points of view from the panelists on standards that you also wanted to bring in?
We've heard a few different perspectives and reuse cases, of which we are one. There's Nick's project you mentioned about opening an ISA and the potential conflict between know your customer and digital IT. So if these things are challenging, or can be challenging within an industry, then what I'd like to see us get more ambitious about is reaching out across industries. So in our case, some of the firms we would expect to run pension dashboards are the same who would be account information service providers for open banking. And if we've got two different standards for proving your identity, then that could be a problem. That problem could be overcome, but we haven't really started to explore that yet, and that's something that I would like to do.
Interesting. Chelsea?
I mentioned one other thing, and it's really in the tech community, and I've probably seen it more from the States, but there's really work being done in tech standards communities within the W3C and others, and as well centered around the idea of open blockchain networks. And what I would say is that independent of what our views may be on whether a blockchain-based chassis is right for identity systems, what I would say is that there's a drum beating there, and the way that the tech marches on there is important, as well the tech as it marches on, where it is actually just not the mobile phone or the PC that I'm dealing with, right? And you know, to Nick's point about the password, it's just gone. I mean, my interaction mode may be just voice in the car. And so how do I deal, how do I work? So tech as an important factor to how we begin figuring this out is really important, and we shouldn't ignore it.
Well, for sharing the work that you have been doing and sharing your opinion here today and questions. Before we move into questions, can you just have a big hand for the points of view here today? Thank you very much. So we've got a good amount of time for audience questions. Great to see that there are people so keen. The mic is coming to you, sir. Please do share your name, where you're from, and also if it's to particular people on the panel, please do make that evident too. Thank you.
Steve Panner for Consult Hyperion. I've got a question about a slightly different reuse of digital identity. Yesterday I received a letter from Equifax telling me that my data has been compromised and that my identity is now being reused by people that I didn't authorize to get access to my data. And so obviously if we're thinking about a new ecosystem, a new set of infrastructure for identity, I want to be sure that we don't end up in the same place in the future. So I'd be interested to hear the panel's view on whether we're going far enough in terms of security by design and privacy by design. Thank you.
Are we going far enough? Who would like to pick up that first?
There's always more that we can do. I think that with regards to the recent hack, although the details have been out there, I'm not completely sure that like anyone's details have not already got out there somewhere. So when you start to think about an identity process or protecting a customer sign-up, you really need to kind of go from the basis that the information could have been compromised and it needs to be secured in a certain way. So there's certainly a lot more that we can do. From the negative side, we do a lot more sharing, so kind of fraudulent events, credit events are shared quite well. Identity is not shared that well, and I think if it's done right, so you share the data for a positive reason, it can actually improve the overall security. There's a lot more that we can do. Identity in general is not shared, so sharing sounds risky, but I think if it's done in the right way, it actually makes it more secure.
Did you have another point of view? Charles and then Nick?
It's not one time and it's not one source, right? So this is a living, breathing, dynamic thing that that must evolve with the time. So if we kind of get infrastructure right, this is all about risk management. If I'm trying to get to know Don, in some cases I may be able to ask a couple people about Don, and in other cases I may have to ask 10 people. And the way I deal with that today versus the way I deal with it in a year from now may be a little different as well. So it's not for one time, it's not for one data source.
Nick, did you want to add?
Yeah, a similar point really is that when we're establishing IDs now, particularly those to a higher standard, we're using multiple different factors to establish them. Well, I won't use the word factor because I'll use that in a minute. Multiple different sources of information, either documents, data sources, to make sure that you've got a good spread there to make sure an ID is true before you grant the ID. But then when we do issue the ID, coming back to the password point, we are issuing them at the moment with pretty weak credential factors that we need to, as an industry, evolve to stronger ones. And something like PSD2, is very prescriptive around the way you need to do authorization for someone in terms of their strong customer authorization. Something you are, something you have, something 2 out of those. That feels like that will just become the de facto standard for all transactions once the biometrics evolve to support that. But on top of that, fraud controls are really important. So to your point about fridges, so one of the solutions we provide is device-based fraud detection. We see loads of Samsung fridges at the moment. Fraudsters love them because they're open. You can drop you can drop a little bit of malware, a little bot on there. It'll run out of the fridge and you can bounce stuff through it. It works absolutely fantastically. So we've got to have when we look at ID, the flip side is fraud, and we've got to make sure we've got very robust fraud controls around everything that we define and do.
There's a mic coming to you just a sec. Do that again, Harry.
Harry Webber-Brown. Quick question, actually. Do you think it's going to take a killer application from the private sector to really drive the take-up, or do we need some sort of consumer communications around what the benefits of having a digital identity that can be used across multiple sectors?
Unfortunately, when Steve Jobs was dreaming about the iPhone and what it may mean, he was actually trying to envision a better future for consumers, and consumers weren't out there saying, I need this. So there is a bit of a chicken and an egg here. Private sector and those that are offering services out to consumers need to be thinking proactively about how to make life better for consumers. And I think a lot of us that are in the infrastructure business in enabling customers to do that need to be kind of on that same page.
I just said, yeah. Oh, sorry. Killer app maybe a customer communications campaign. I'm not convinced that people would take it up. It's having the need to do it. So some of the verified examples, like doing a tax return or checking your state pension, are good examples. So having something that people need to do and want to do, rather than it's seeing the ID verification as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. I doubt someone's going to wake up and think, I know what I want to do today.
Sorry, Paul, just before you, James.
Really, it's about the kind of having a need to want to use it. So I think everyone can relate to the problem of having lots of different usernames and passwords. We talked about whether the password is the right thing, but everyone hates the fact that you want to log on to something, you've got another username and password, and there's actually solutions you can buy which help you manage all of your passwords. So just when people start to understand that there's another way you could potentially log in with a single system, and that single system can be used in lots of different places, that will just drive adoption. So it's really, if it actually does something, people will adopt it.
I fully agree. I think making something easy and slick and seamless to the point where you as a user just about get that you're doing something, but you're not too concerned what it is, I think, is where it will get to. I mean, I'm thinking from a personal example, I'm going through the process of getting my first mortgage at the moment, and the incredible amount of times I had to prove my identity to everybody and everybody else. I mean, even the people in this building where I'm getting my mortgage from, I prove my identity, but I come here every day. So it's a bit, it's strange that no kind of real use case, apart from probably something like a Facebook Connect, style approach has emerged yet. I'm surprised we as an industry haven't cracked making it really easy. But I think we will, and I think the scale point, I don't think it's going to come like that, but I think there will be a momentum building that will go as more and more organisations see the benefit of higher levels of verification.
Thank you, James. More questions?
Ian and positive attributes. One of the benefits of driving Verify into the private sector will be driving innovation. I'm just wondering, from the panel's point of view, the sorts of innovation that you might expect and like to see on top of what's already available with gov.uk Verify as it moves out into the private sector with private sector hubs.
Yeah, obviously we're a Verify supplier. Continue to invest in new tools for both, principally at the moment ID verification, and we and others are rolling out new tools that will support the LOA 1 standard, so that's an innovation in itself in terms of making it easier for people to get an ID. We have a roadmap of things that we're going to be delivering in the next 12 months or so to try and improve the range of options to allow people to get IDs, be that new data sources or new ways to ID people that we will include to make it easier to get the conversion rate up. We need to innovate to make it available to more citizens online instantly. So I think this is still a very young market at the moment. From our point of view, we will continue to invest in that to bring in new tools. The other area of innovation then is around credentials, bringing in frictionless ways to use ID. If this is going to be successful, ultimately the ones that will prevail will not just be the ones with the critical mass, it'll be the ones whose critical mass is very easy and compelling to use. So we're going to need to innovate a lot around that as we go forward.
My name is Joseph Spear. I represent Mvine Limited, a British SME working in tech. In our conference session today, much has been said and understood about gov.uk Verify. But elsewhere in the IT world, and also in other small, medium and large businesses, people are oblivious about gov.uk Verify. So, for example, last week at QE2 Centre at the Personal Information Economy event, only Don Thibault and Sarah Munro were the only speakers to address gov.uk Verify from the front. Everyone else had a glazed over look, including in the audience. So my question is simple. What can private sector organisations such as the panel represents be doing to get the message out? And what should public sector organisations such as Cabinet Office be doing to get the message out to citizens? Thank you.
Good and interesting question. We are not represented by Cabinet Office on the panel, so I might leave the second half of your question, and we do have a private sector. Any responses to the gentleman, please?
I think we need to move to the point where operationally, providers of verified digital identities are allowed and have the ability to deliver into the private sector. So that's point number one. Point number two then says, once that's the case, I'm sure we're going to see a lot of energy behind talking about that because there's then commercial motivation. So I think those are the two things.
Any points to add?
Yes, I think the key thing, so I'm not so sure that the promotion of the service itself is necessary. It's more so, as Charles mentioned, if it were to be used in a commercial sector and then integrated into many services, you could actually promote all of the services that you can now use your Verify ID with. So really that would be the key driver in actually making it relevant for the consumer, because just having a Verify ID doesn't really give you anything. It's what you go do with it. At the moment there's some government services available through it. There's not many. You can't use it outside of government. So really it's the wider scale adoption of it, and then of course the promotion of what you can do with it. I think that's what will drive it.
Yeah, compelling private sector reuse cases, I guess, are the example, and there are probably some reuse cases that have not been identified yet. So there might be someone from a trade body sat at a conference somewhere else thinking, I would like to deliver this project, but they're not aware that there is a digital identity solution for them.
Louise Bennett, Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group to gov.uk Verify. are banks going to accept gov.uk verify IDs at LOA2 as equivalent to know your customer?
Anyone want to? Also in the lunch break as well.
I'm happy to fill that.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick.
Well, it's a question of how they align to the standards that banks work with, and I think that needs to be worked through. So one of the things that the IDPs are working with GDS on at the moment is, as we look at private sector, how will the LOA 1 and 2 standards align to the standards defined for KYC, the JMLSG standards? On the face of it, this is my personal opinion, my reading of it is an LOA 2 in terms of the amount of due diligence that's been done to establish one goes beyond what the JMLSG standards would require in all cases, in all ways of establishing an LOA 2. For LOA 1, it depends how you've got there. And sometimes you will have done 2 proofs, sometimes you will have done 1 with lots of extra verification. So there's a mapping exercise there, and that's really work in progress right now to work out how those things map.
Any more questions from the floor?
Arthur van der Wees from Amsterdam, together with Har from iLabs. The question is, it follows a bit on the Equifax hack. So we talk about the password that is not what people like. Biometrics sounds like an obvious next, but you only have one person, you have only one biometric, you have only one fingerprint. So when that gets hacked, which also happened at Equifax actually, then you will have a big problem. So I think that is actually too much and too highly sensitive to use for certain access and authentication. Whether you agree or not, but what would be your best alternative beyond biometrics? So using another way of identity.
Interesting debate. Paul?
So I think the key would be how you use biometrics. So if you look at, say, phones are now supporting kind of biometric authentication. If you can authenticate that the phone is real, you're effectively using biometrics by proxy. I completely agree with you. Having a database full of people's biometric data would be a very bad idea. If it gets stolen, you can't replace your fingers. It's a bad idea. Unlike your password, you can reset it. It's good. So I think the way to do it is to actually kind of secure them through something that you already know. So secure it for a phone is a fairly good way of implementing a biometric authentication process without actually putting the biometric details in anywhere where they can be stolen.
Any points from the panel?
I think maybe back to my earlier point that one would wish we could take the password and replace it with blank. There is no blank. Okay, that's kind of the point, that this is, I think, about layers, about the collage, about asking multiple questions, doing that in real time. So this is about creating the intelligence engine about knowing Don. That's the answer. Biometrics play a role. Dynamic data that may come from a bank or from a mobile network operator play a role. Data that a credit rating agency have play a role. Data that the Post has plays a role. And then the interchange of information about bad data to help self-correcting the ecosystem is necessary. So I don't think this is about this or this or this and not this, 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 this. It's about creating the collage and the engine, almost AI for ID.
On this issue particularly, I'm going to pull in Ralph.
Hi, Ralph Bragg. I'm the Trust Framework and Solutions Architect for Open Banking's Trust Framework for the UK. So there's been, on the panel, there's been a lot of great debate and a lot of backwards and forwards between the relying parties and the OP providers. And just a general point on the role of this data being used as identity attributes. Yes, it can be, but there's nothing in Open Banking or PSD2 that says you have to say anything about who the user is. So to the points that a lot of the panel members have made is that there's nothing stopping you getting your father's credentials, logging on and saying, I am my dad. So on the topic of the collage of data that is going to need to be aggregated to form, I suppose, this statement to consume all these different vectors of trust, How much involvement, if any, or are any of the panels aware of the vectors of trust work that's being done in the Internet Engineering Task Force? And do you have any plans to roll out statements, that collage statement that allows relying parties to make their own judgment decisions about how well you say in a test that you know your customer, as well as how well or how confident you are and what mechanisms you've used to authenticate your customer, rather than the LOA 0, 1, 2, and 3 broad brush strokes levels that we have today, which are broadly recognized as being not necessarily appropriate in the age of biometrics or data, et cetera, et cetera.
So the statement of trust, collage rolling out and putting that into the hands of consumers.
You know, at the end of the day, when you take a look at a verify credential, there is, in fact, a bit of a collage going on there, right? And that implementation is in essence up to the 7 identity providers and the verify scheme to implement in the most appropriate ways, some good government standard on how that be done. At the end of the day, and I think we talked a little bit about this notion of bringing additional attribute data to bear to help a relying party determine that they're okay to take action X, Y, or Z is the other component that's necessary. So to let this topic become free form for a relying party always is probably not the way to go. But if you can get 60, 70, 80% of the way there with a verify X level digital ID that you can communicate on to the public, that Uncle Joe knows what it means, and you've got a few other data bits that you're asking the consumer about and then have validated through other sources, then you've got a framework that can work. So good security, additional value add that the RP can check, and a consumer that understands what's going on. I don't know whether that answers what you were asking.
And I think all of that is embodied in a trust scheme. So bringing all of those elements together and laying out a scheme that is documented, that is a legal scheme that everyone subscribes to, that means that a relying party, you know, if they're going to trust an identity asserted from an IDP, trust it. And if there is an issue, it can be evidenced who did what and why, and everyone's complying with the standards. But that's got to be carefully constructed. Going back to the point I said earlier, you don't want to make that too onerous for everyone in the chain. It's got to be secure, but particularly at the relying party end, where you want thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, not tens, you've got to make it as simple as possible there. And the IDP hub end, where you're going to have tens, maybe, that can be much more complicated and should be. The bar should be very high to be in there, but relying parties have got to be able to rely on that quite simply.
Yes and no. So in terms of the work we've been doing with industry for trying to create the standards for open banking, and it goes back to the question we just had from asking about whether or not a bank is going to be able to rely on just a number, a 2. Cannot rely on that. And for open banking, particularly where we're talking about business identities, I would like to just segue a little bit into another question. We've spoken a lot about the consumer. What is the panel's view of, and where do you think the industry is going to go in terms of establishing identities about individuals, companies, and the relationships that those individuals have with companies, i.e. the OP check? Because one of the biggest business-to-business enablers for identity, and one of the biggest challenges we've faced with open banking, is proving that it's not just, you aren't just Nick Mothershaw, it's not just Experian, you are Nick Mothershaw, a director at Experian, and authorized to operate on behalf of that organization. And that level of, well, those OP checks and that establishment of individual identities and business identities and the relationships between them is pretty much the linchpin to unlocking open banking, and the trust framework has been built on providing that level of service. Where do you see yourselves, in a lot of cases, as identity providers moving in that space, if at all?
Do you want me to get Ralph to pre-say this question? Who would like to come in first?
Can I touch on it? So I think it's a very important use case. I don't think we've done much work on it. Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but being able to say, yeah, especially in the kind of SME space, this is James Anderson. He's the financial director. He can do payments up to X or Y. Is quite a compelling kind of digital experience to have. You don't have to go through lots of different steps of delegated authority and all this kind of type of stuff. So I think it's definitely something we need to do. And I think, you know, with the Verify world and how it evolves, government looking at how they make tax digital for SMEs and for corporates as well, that's going to kind of play into there as well.
It does come back to standards. You know, can you rely on LOA 012, etc. You know, innovation is going to continue in this area, right? Of course it is. And the standards need to keep up with innovation. So the question for our part of the world, for our project, and I guess for DWP now, is who governs those standards? We haven't really talked about the governance of them today. Is that, and primarily, is that a private sector role or a public sector or somewhere in between? So there's a question back. But I guess that's a challenge for open banking going forward as well, right?
Thank you, and that's something I'm sure you'll have great discussion about over lunch shortly too. But Paul?
Yeah, so just in response to Ralph's question, we certainly recognise the problem. We don't have a solution for it. So if you kind of put it into context, in the to comply with the 4th EU AML regs, you're required to kind of understand the ownership of a company. So generally that's quite difficult at the moment. So to go a further level and understand the employees of a company, their authority within it, it's certainly a difficult problem to solve, and I agree it needs to be done, but I'm just not sure there is a solution. There's a potential data solution requiring companies to kind of submit that type of information to an authority to have it there to verify, but yeah, currently there's certainly no easy way of doing it.
There's examples elsewhere in the world where this had been implemented, and you get into the situation where, you know, the named director of the company has to be the one that authorises stuff, and for a lot of companies, you know, those named directors are actually, you know, very hands-off. So it's that ability to then delegate authority within that needs to be built into any standards, but also manage that authority, and that's where companies have problems today in terms of, you know, managing who's got access to what, which employees have what authorities. So any standards that are defined, that's got to be very carefully thought about.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for just one last question. There was this gentleman very patiently sat over here. Thank you very much. The mic's just coming to you.
Hi, Chris Jones from Icon UK, a UK SME acting in the identity and documentation space. So this conference is really about the economics of identity, but we've had not a lot talked about specifics of costs and the like, and costs dictate options. And certainly, you know, dynamic biometrics are more powerful than static biometrics. You know, not all data is equal, just as not all biometrics are equal. So the question really is, in terms of the economic cost of identity, when is £1 too little or 1p too much in terms of an identity that is validated or processed?
Back to our pensions case study, one of the big decisions DWP will have to make is whether they opt for a single central gov.uk dashboard, or as we've envisaged it, a marketplace for dashboards, commercial marketplace. One of the big unknowns about the commercial marketplace will be the cost of entering, and part of the cost of entering will be digital identity. I don't think I can answer your specific question about when is it too little or too much, but I guess those firms with scale will be more able to enter that market, and I guess at some point the cost will become too prohibitive for startups who could operate in that space. But I imagine that the cost will gradually come down.
Yeah, costs will come down over time, inevitably. I think there is a careful journey that we need to take over the next, and it may only be 12 months, in defining what the value of a digital identity is to the relying party. Because it's very easily compared to an ID check that's done on the back end today. And if you think about how you establish a Verify LOA2, and all the different elements that go into making it up, the different data sources that are used, the checks, the document checks that aren't available anywhere else, the process that's gone through, the credentials that are issued, the help desks and certifications that sit around all of that you know, the IDPs have gone through to attain that ability to issue a Verify LOA2. That's a lot of value that you've packaged into that compared to calling into a few databases and getting a bit of a footprint. And I think it's important and incumbent on us as an industry to make sure that that value isn't overly commoditized, it is recognized, because that value gives you more security, it gives you built-in fraud checks, it gives you the answer to the thin file problem in part that people have been grappling with for years, and that's incredibly valuable. So I think, you know, as we move into private sector use, we will dance around our handbags, all of us, the relying parties, the people providing hubs, people providing identities as to what pricing should be. But I think we need to remember that you know, what we're doing here is creating a lot of value for the relying parties, and that needs to, you know, should be recognised.
I would say that there's probably two dynamics here, and as the curves begin to intersect or play, so I think for sure, as we do more and more digitally, the topic of getting it right and putting the right diligence behind it, and the bar associated with what we have to do begins to go up. So it becomes more important, becomes a little harder, there's more to it, is number one. And so that's a dynamic that says that value delivery does start to go up. The other is in the very title of reuse. The idea is to not have Barclays, BA, HMRC, Qantas, on and on and on and on, all do the same thing. And that then says that there's great economic efficiency in having an instrument that I can reuse. So we got value going up, importance going up, and one-time action that tends to drive it down. Now, how those two curves interplay is important to probably get right. And obviously in a market that's just beginning, what you may see coming out may need to be tuned the right way to allow for entry.
Thank you very much. And that closes our panel on the importance of reuse and digital identities. Please can you join me in giving a great big thank you to James, Nick, Rob, Charles and Paul. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much.